You're locked in to the Grain Market Talk podcast. Fast updates, market movers, and the grain news you need right now. Trading commodity futures and options involves substantial risk of loss and is not suitable for all investors.
Today is July 2nd. I've got Jordan here with us. How's it going, Jordan?
Good. How are you, Mike?
We're doing good. It's a 3-day weekend here. No markets tomorrow on Friday, and then we'll be back at it again on Sunday night. We had a pretty interesting week in the grain markets. I feel like July 4th is always a pivotal time of the year going in. It feels somewhat familiar. Trump speaking at the Mount Rushmore this weekend, so that'll be exciting. See if he says anything new. But 3-day long weekend ahead of July 4th here, and we had a fun week in the grain market, didn't we?
Yes, we did. Kind of surprising. We actually had a 20-cent rally off our lows here this week. So, kind of a decent opportunity to maybe price some grain here heading into the weekend.
Very much so. Let's start talking about some of the reasoning here. If you kind of look at the report here that we had this week, the quarterly stocks and the acreage reports, I'll have Cade pull that up there. As you can see, this was a classic case of just sell the rumor, buy the fact, in my opinion. The markets had sold off prior to this report, the few trading sessions before it, really hard. And then after we saw the numbers come out, which I would have argued, at least acreage-wise, I thought was pretty bearish. And then looking at quarterly stocks, which we can get into that as well, and maybe a little bit friendly on the corn side. But it just felt like the trade was relieved that the report was done and over with, and then traded things a little bit back higher. So how did you take the report and some of what we saw?
Yeah, so like you said, we saw a little bit of a bounce because the market sold off heading into it. And I think the market was afraid that we were going to see more of last year kind of repeat on these acres reports where, last year we saw acres raised 2 or 3 times during the growing season. So, I felt like the market was kind of getting ready for that kind of surprise, right? Now, that didn't happen. On this acreage report, we ended up seeing 95.3 on corn, which was no change from the March report and a little bit higher than what the average trade estimate was. The trade estimate was just under 95. So we do confirm big corn acres for this year, right? Soybeans, 85.3. That was up from 84.7 in the March report, but the average trade estimate was right there with it. So really no change there. So no real surprises in the acres report just kind of confirmed big acres on corn. Now, when you flip to the stocks report, that's where you kind of get that little bit of a bullish report, like you were saying earlier, Mike, right? Soybean stocks, just over $1 billion. Market thought, very similar numbers, no surprise. But corn stocks, 5.3 billion compared to the average of 5.4. Now, that's 100 million less bushels there, right? And right now, you can pull up the USDA report and specifically point at the export number. And with the sales that we've had recently, it's light. We know that the USDA needs to raise that number. But what this does is, more or less confirms that. It also confirms the hefty feed and residual number. Back, probably in January, February, we were talking a lot about how that number was very large and, a big increase year over year probably needs to kind of be pulled down. Well, all this stocks report is doing is confirming that big feed number, and exports are very strong. So demand is running rampant today.
One of the few takeaways on the quarterly stocks report was there's a lot of corn in the Western Corn Belt still sitting on farmers' bin storage here in Minnesota and South Dakota, specifically. Jordan, any takes on that with where that crop is sitting?
Yeah, great point. When you pull up that stocks report, it kind of shows, what's on farm today, what's not. And today in Minnesota, we're 22% more stocks out there in Minnesota. So, big corn crop in Minnesota last year and in South Dakota. And it's showing, the farmer has a lot of corn left in his bins today. So we've seen basis tighten up on corn here as of recently because of that board falling off and cash prices dipping under $4 and the grain farmer not willing to sell that. But as you kind of look forward, you look to that and say, we got a pretty good crop coming at us now that we've seen some recent rainfall. And with what's still in the bin, basis, more than likely when you kind of get into August is going to be pretty sloppy again. So if you do have some old crop corn, that's something to maybe kind of think about taking advantage of. Now, when you look at soybeans, the exact opposite. The grain farmer got rid of quite a bit of soybeans off the combine and, moved soybeans, kept corn. And now you look at the on-farm storage there on soybeans, and there really isn't any stocks there. We've seen it on basis also, but to an even more extreme point this week is what we saw. Some positive pushes being offered as recently as today on some processors looking for some soybeans.
Yeah, hot bids for the soybean old crop here in this current month. On the acreage side, a lot of acres between corn and soybeans combined, over 180 million. So pretty much pushing a record there between most soybean and corn acres planted in a year combined. You throw wheat in there, that's basically where some of those acres came from. Only 42 million in the wheat this year, lowest in basically a long, long time, Jordan, before you and I were here. So from that perspective, anyways, it sure seems like the Corn Belt continues to grow a little bit with corn and soybeans. The urban sprawl hasn't really brought those acres down quite yet, just moving other crops out of the way at this point. As we look at the futures market reaction, yeah, we mentioned a little bit earlier, a nice pop this week through some of the week, providing a little bit of opportunities. I would have liked a little bit better close today on D's corn. If we could have held green pretty much across the board, it would have been nice. A lot of these months, we were floating 3 straight days of higher closes, and that would have been the first time since May 11th that we've seen that. So it's been quite some time that we've been able to gather a few trading sessions in a row together to have some green prices, but long term, this report basically did us no good, I think, long run for fundamentals, giving us an opportunity to provide a boost, especially if we get into weather here. Weather looks pretty good going forward into a key time frame of pollination, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. We sat here last week and we were kind of looking at this hot, dry forecast here for the West. And, with quite a bit of the South Dakota and Nebraska crops in drought, felt like we could really probably see good to excellent scores decrease over the next few weeks with a deteriorating crop with this high heat. Now we got into this week and that forecast really kind of did a 180 on us, right? Moved to a more wetter forecast and didn't really see the high temps that were kind of forecasted. Now it was hot, but humidity came with it, right? So now you're looking at a really, really nice crop out there here in the Western Corn Belt. And then the opposite is kind of true for the Eastern Corn Belt. There's kind of this dividing line through Iowa, right? That shows the Eastern Corn Belt is pretty moist out there. They've had quite a bit of rain here over the past few weeks, and they very much welcomed this hot, dry forecast and are benefiting from that. So, really kind of beneficial forecast for both sides of the Iowa line. As you kind of look forward, you talked a little bit about that close on corn. Didn't trade up through 450 there on December corn. We had some highs, I believe, around 444, 445. That area, that 450 area, is kind of a pivotal point on the chart. If we do kind of trade above that, close above that, that would signal a little bit of a bullish run there. But as you look at this crop maybe getting a little bit better and looking at past years when we kind of start talking about above trend line crops that we could be talking about now, they tend to be pretty big. If you're going to get an above trend line yield, over the past 30 years, it's been anywhere from 5 to 8 bushels higher. So then you're kind of starting to talk about this 187 to 190 type crop. And like you said, that shapes up for some lower prices. Now, when you look at last year, 2024, 2014, I mentioned 2014 just because, this year's chart is shaping up to look very, very similar. We did trade below $4. We kind of saw this market pull lower after July 4th. And as you kind of moved into August, dip down into that 390 to 370 level. So, I keep thinking about some extra bushels that you may have now that the forecast has kind of changed. Those bushels, you should be kind of thinking about them if you can't store them and maybe making some more sales. Looking at earlier, we were probably talking APH type crop. If you're looking at above APH type crop by 10%, maybe making another 10% sale makes a lot of sense.
Definitely. And just one other thing, chart wise, that's pretty good technical resistance. Those old lows being support before, becoming maybe a key resistance point now is something that I'm really going to be focusing on myself just with this chart action. Because on the soybean side, we're still sitting okay, like $11.50. It still really hasn't deteriorated much, and it makes sense. Corn usually goes down first. First weather premium kind of comes out. August soybean weather is important, and we're not quite there yet. So we've got to wait a little bit more for that to come out. That's kind of what I'm looking at on the soybean side, is just a little bit more time. On the weather story, it's interesting because it's shaping up okay. There's maybe a few problems here or there all over the Corn Belt, whether you're too too wet in the east or a little bit too dry previously in the west. But it is interesting, like just if there is something to note about the volatility of weather with hail, tornadoes, windstorms, things like that. I always have on in the background of the office Bloomberg, and it's a New York, very hedge fund type trading, big commodity pictures and whatnot. And right before we came and did this podcast, on their top news bar on there, they had the wind farm by in South Dakota was their main headline, that they were talking about how excess winds of over 130 miles an hour this week by Highmore, South Dakota, up to a level Category 4 hurricane. Volatility, a weird thing, one, for them to be talking about. They were talking about it from a wind energy perspective with the windmills getting damaged, but just volatile weather out there, kind of scattered out throughout the western Corn Belt here has been an observation of mine, with hail and wind and things like that to start off our growing season.
Yeah, it's definitely been volatile, but it's brewed up some moisture, some much needed moisture.
I'll take it because, man, we were so dry, sitting 4 inches or so in South Dakota year to date in rain in locations, to now up over 6 at a key time frame right before 100-degree-ish days. This will be an incredible boost for yields going forward. So any other final thoughts as we wrap up here before the weekend, really?
Yeah, so just really kind of paying attention to this chart and the way this trade kind of reacts. Making sure that we're getting some working orders out there, and if you feel a little bit undersold, now's the time to kind of take action and look at this market and look at the carry that it's showing out there. Mike, 460 March corn can make a lot of sense for some guys throwing some corn in some bins.
For sure. And please consult us about some of those option strategies revolving those two. If you don't love that price, but kind of still want to work something up, we can help formulate a plan for you all. Some interesting headlines just watch for the weekend here. Continue to watch weather, continue to watch whatever Trump says at Mount Rushmore this weekend at my home state. It'll be a really interesting weekend from a few news headline perspectives. So thank you for your time. Please click the link in the description below. That'll take you to our daily market commentary and other cool market insights. Please go to our website at professionalagmarketing.com, and please have a happy, safe weekend.